Russia should be in this meeting. Why are we having a meeting without Russia being in the meeting? You know, whether you like it or not, and it may not be politically correct, but we have a world to run.
President Trump splits the G7, declaring that he wants Russia back in the fold.
President Trump has put a hand grenade in the middle of the G7 and in the middle of the Western consensus of how you run global economic affairs.
But the rest of the world seems in no mood to humour him. We'll ask what's his game plan, if he even has one. Good evening. Fresh from being love-bombed by Boris Johnson in his leaked speech last night, President Trump today threatened the unity of the G7 group of nations, even before he took off from Washington for the summit in Canada. Mr. Trump called on Russia to be readmitted to the grouping, a suggestion he was later backed on by the new Italian Prime Minister, Giuseppe Conte. Theresa May immediately rejected the idea, saying we should remind ourselves why the G8 became the G7 after Russia illegally annexed Crimea. Earlier, she had said, with reference to the trade row, that the US remain good friends who can talk frankly with each other when they disagree. But the Prime Minister will not be able to take Trump to task over Russia because he is the only leader with whom she is not having individual talks. As this most unusual of summits continues, President Trump has managed to split the West and undermine the work Theresa May did in uniting the G7 in condemnation of Russia over the Skripal's poisoning. So what is Trump's game, and what now for global diplomacy? Here's Mark Urban.
These summits are always the focus for protest and caricature. And in these times of megaphone diplomacy and rising protectionism, we're becoming used to questioning what these meetings can actually achieve. But we seem to be in a new phase now, with a president who so often exceeds the cartoon version of himself.
I think that President Trump has put a hand grenade in the middle of the G7 and in the middle of the Western consensus of how you run global economic affairs. We have relied in the West on the America being, okay, with some exceptions like everyone, but the ultimate upholder of a win-win, absolute gains global trading system. Donald Trump is 180 degrees the opposite. He is somebody who sees everything as a win-lose setup.
Following America's imposition of steel and aluminium tariffs and the EU's promise of retaliation, the mood music was bad enough. President Macron has been talking about the G6+1 if necessary, and the Canadian Prime Minister had this to say about Trump's arguments for tariffs.
Perhaps he will revise or review his statements. France and NATO, this is ridiculous to think that they could be a threat to the United States' security. In reality, France is the closest ally that the United States has had for quite some time.
And as if to escalate, President Trump, on his way north today, also toyed with the idea of changing the membership, throwing out the idea of making the G7 back into the G8.
I would recommend, and it's up to them, but Russia should be in the meeting. It should be a part of it. You know, whether you like it or not, and it may not be politically correct, but we have a world to run. And in the G7, which used to be the G8, they threw Russia out. They should let Russia come back in, because we should have Russia at the negotiating table.
The conventional wisdom is that the G7 summit is a useful diary date, a chance for Western leaders, plus Japan, to get together and iron out their differences. But under President Trump, many now question whether conventional wisdom can still be applied to diplomacy at all.
I do think Donald Trump's national outlook, his America First approach, makes the G7 not a diary opportunity but a diary risk. Because the G7 is not like the G20. The G7 isn't just economics, it's security, climate, economic challenges all rolled into one. And at the moment, the rest of America's allies in America disagree on just about every point.
It was time for an uneasy jostle, the so-called family photo beloved by summit organisers. Presidents Trump and Macron managed the briefest of bilaterals, but the open question is whether the seven will be able to agree enough for any kind of communique. President Trump, meanwhile, looks forward to his date with Kim Jong-un.
Mark Urban. So what prospect of the G7 actually agreeing anything this weekend? And if they don't, does it matter? Jonathan Powell is with me. He went to his fair share of summits during a decade as Tony Blair's Chief of Staff. Mark Lotter was a special assistant to President Trump in the White House and joins us from Washington. Good evening to both of you. First of all, Mark Lotter, is this all about Donald Trump making mischief, trying to kind of destabilise what he might see as the cosy setup of the G7?
No, I think what you see is the president taking his message directly to his fellow world leaders, talking about the need to equal the playing field, especially as it relates to international trade. We have been on the bad and on the losing side of many of these trade agreements for a very long time. The president was very clear when he ran for office that he was going to back the needs of American workers first. And so in many cases, we face unfair tariffs and non-monetary regulations that limit our abilities.
Let's come on to trade in a moment. But what about asking, insisting that Russia comes back in appeals to his base in America? Where's the locus for that?
I think what you're seeing there is recognizing that we need to be able to have a discussion with all of the world leaders, and so we can address the challenges that we face together.
Well, let me just turn to Jonathan Powell. Let's just go through a few things. No Paris Climate Agreement, no Iran deal, moving the embassy to Jerusalem, tariffs on steel and aluminium, wanting Putin back in. Is this about Trump calling the shots or just being a disruptor?
Well, he clearly is a disruptor. I think the Russia thing is simply a way of distracting from the fact that everyone else was united against him on trade. I remember when we invited Russia the first time to the Birmingham summit and created the G8, with Yeltsin was in charge, and then they were thrown out in 2014 for invading Crimea. It would be a very odd message to send to invite them back now they've murdered Skripal and so on. I don't think President Trump means that seriously. It's a way of distracting attention from what was being said to him.
It's not a serious suggestion from Trump, Mark Lotter.
I think it's throwing out there a carrot that we need to be able to offer something to Vladimir Putin to encourage him to stop the destabilizing activities, to stop doing many of the things that we have seen, and why the G7 or the G8 became the G7 in the first place. But if there is a carrot out there for him to come back and rejoin the world community, the president would be open to it.
Does it not really matter to Trump about the Skripals? Does it not matter about the attack in Salisbury? Does it not matter about Crimea? Is he just saying that this is get real, this is real politics, we have to run the world, so therefore no matter what Russia does, it can come back in?
It's not acknowledging or condoning any of those activities. What it's saying is we need to see positive movement from Russia in the future going forward. And if this is a carrot of something that they would welcome, and it would help to de-escalate the growing tension that is taking place with Russia, then it's something that the president would consider.
Well, Jonathan Powell, the idea, of course, that Italy's falling in behind Trump. Now, you've got economic nationalism, you've got populism. These forces that clearly have some purchase within his own constituency.
Well, I think I put Trump and the new Italian government in slightly different baskets from that point of view. I think the interesting thing about Trump is that he is a disruptor, and being a disruptor can sometimes be quite useful, as in North Korea. But in an awful lot of places, if you're a disruptor and you don't have a plan, if you break down the Iran agreement and you don't have a plan B, and all the European diplomats come to Washington and say, OK, so now what? And you say, well, we don't know. Then that's a problem. America is supposed to be offering world leadership. If it abdicates, that vacuum will be filled by others like Xi in China.
Well, you say he has to offer world leadership. He might say, and Benjamin Netanyahu said the other day, that the Iran deal's dead. We don't even need to discuss it, because if Trump walks away from the Iran deal, it is dead. That's true, though, isn't it?
It may be, but then so what's next? Yeah. And that's what the Europeans are asking. They're used to Washington coming up with ideas, having a plan. If you do something one day without having thought what the plan on the next day is, you've got a bit of a problem.
Yes, and Trudeau was saying in Canada, you can say that you have got steel and aluminium tariffs because of national security, Mark Lotter, but you're not going to say there's a national security for pharmaceuticals and all sorts of other things. I mean, where is the next step, as Jonathan Powell says?
What the president is saying is that we need to have fair and reciprocal trade. That is the next step, is that we need our allies and our friends, and this has nothing to do with our long-standing commitment to our allies, our friends, as it relates to many other issues. But when it comes to this disagreement among friends on the economy, it's time, and many presidents have talked about this before, but very few have actually had the leadership to actually take action on it. This is a president who believes in backing up what he promised to do, and he wants to make this a reciprocal, fair trade agreement between us and our allies and friends.
Just going back to the populism for a moment, people look at the G7, they think it's a cosy club, and it's actually not. It's not got all sorts of countries that actually matter. India, South American countries, and so forth. Then actually, the time for the G7s may be over, and if it doesn't end with a joint statement, which has never happened before, would that suggest now that it's an empty vessel?
No, I mean, they do spend an awful lot of time negotiating that statement. It would be being negotiated for months leading up to this. But frankly, the statements are always irrelevant. The statement does not matter. What matters is what actually happens at the summit. And usually it's some other event that takes over. And in this case, it will be the trade issue, it will be Iran, and it will be North Korea. Those will be what they're actually talking about.
But the problem surely is with Donald Trump heading off to Singapore to prepare for Kim Jong-un. They can talk to each other all they want, but without an American negotiation there, it's meaningless.
Well, as I said, being a disruptor can be in its right place, can make a difference. Being a disruptor in North Korea, there's no way that Obama would be sitting down in Singapore with Kim Jong-un with no preparation in this way. It's very high stakes, but it could work in this case. The trouble is all the other things where it doesn't work and we're plunged into disarray.
Is this all this? He's got Donald Trump's got approval ratings among Republicans or whatever it is, it's 87%. And he's keeping his campaign promises. Is this all looking towards the midterms? What is the long-term plan here?
I think the long-term plan is to get America's economy growing again, which we've already seen tremendous growth in the economy, making the world a safer place by dealing with North Korea, and the president's concerns about the Iran deal, the failed Iran deal, and he is willing to work. And we have encouraged our partners in the United Kingdom, in France, in Germany, and others to join us in leveling additional sanctions on the other issues that were never covered in the Iran deal, like ballistic missile technology, exporting terrorism, funding terrorism, so many other things that are destabilizing the Middle East. The president is willing to work with our allies in strengthening that deal to make sure that Iran never has a nuclear weapon, not giving them a timeline 10 years from now where they could have one.
Thank you both very much indeed.